All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. And yeah, we're here because we all are the grown-ups and we got some work to do. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I am Wendy Galernter. I'm one of the leaders of Take Action San Diego, which is a swing left chapter and also a chapter of Indivisible. And this is our monthly meeting. And our main topic today is going to be boycotts. And let's get on with the main topic. So today we're going to focus on winning with boycotts, strategies that worked and still can. And I am your guest speaker today. And part of the reason I volunteered to do this rather than get one of the fantastic guest speakers that we seem to be able to get at these meetings is because, first, it's a topic I'm very interested in. It gave me the opportunity to do a little bit of research, but also because I myself, in my 20s, was very involved with the United Farm Workers Union boycott of grapes and lettuce and Gallo wine. And for a period of about 2 years, I worked for the United Farm Workers Union on their boycott staff, on a staff of several hundred people that were distributed all around the United States. And our jobs were to get supermarkets not to carry grapes or lettuce or Gallo wine. And I'll talk a little bit more about that effort in a bit. But, I have a kind of a connection to it. But more than anything else, the reason I picked this topic for this month is because we're all being flooded with calls to boycott one thing or another, whether it's Spotify or T-Mobile or Tesla or everything, depending on what website you're looking at. And it's a little overwhelming. It's hard to figure out which ones make sense and which ones don't, which ones are worth your time and sacrifice, because usually boycotts involve some sort of sacrifice. So I wanted to look back a little bit in history and ask a few questions. What were some of the most effective boycotts of the past, and did they share any important characteristics? How can we apply those lessons today? And which of the boycotts that are out there right now hold some promise or worth looking into for ourselves and then for our networks? So first, a definition. Boycotting means you're withdrawing your commercial or financial or social relations with a country or an organization or a company or even a person as a punishment or a protest. And in, practical terms, boycotts are one of the most powerful, nonviolent tactics we have of economic non-cooperation. And economic non-cooperation is one of the few ways we have of attacking the pillars that are now holding the Trump regime, the MAGA regime up, because we have huge corporations, billionaires holding that regime up. We have cowardly legislators that are holding that regime up. And the boycott is one of the ways to make them pay attention because somehow they all care about money. So, of course, the idea of a boycott is not new. The word is relatively new, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But as early as 411 BC, Aristophanes was writing a comedy called Lysistrata. And it's not based on a real event, but it is about how the women of Greece have a sex boycott until the men stop fighting in wars in the Greek city-states. And it turns out that in the 1600s, there was a real version of this that happened, and it was among the women of the Iroquois Native Americans who did actually go on a sex strike. They actually were boycotting sex and also childbearing. And it was because the Iroquois Nation was a league in which many of the tribes were fighting each other all the time. The women had no say in the decisions on whether to go to war or not. And they felt they needed a place in that decision-making role. And so the boycott was launched, and they did eventually win a decision, a voice at least, in the decision to go to war. But the modern day version of boycotts, actually, the word is named after a guy who's actually was named Captain Charles Boycott. I thought this was a joke, but it's actually true. He was an English land agent in the 1880s, working in Ireland, where many of the people there were very poor tenant farmers. They didn't own the land themselves. They had to give over most of the crop to the landlord that he was representing. And apparently he was a particularly cruel land agent. He's cruel to the tenant farmers, responsible for a lot of evictions. And eventually, the farmers in one town got together and decided they need to do something about it. And at first, they started just by organizing all the shopkeepers in the town to socially ostracize this guy and his family. So they couldn't buy food, they couldn't get their shoes repaired, they couldn't get their horses shoed, they couldn't go to a pub. They were completely ostracized and isolated in the community. And that was followed then by farmers refusing to harvest the crops, which of course was where the economic cudgel that the farmers had to bear was actually used. And he eventually with his family, had to escape to Dublin and was staying in a hotel that he got kicked out of because he was told that the hotel had been threatened with boycotting if he continued to stay there. So that was the first use of the word boycott, and it stuck not only there, but at this particular time in the 1880s, this idea spread throughout Ireland, where there were similar situations with tenant farmers. But then, of course, it became a word in many languages, not just in English, spread throughout Europe, came to the United States, where they even made a movie in the 1940s called Captain Boycott. And it was not sympathetic to Captain Boycott. It was sympathetic to the Irish tenant farmers. And apparently it is not a horrible movie, so I'm kind of interested in watching it. So that's the origin of the word. But I wanted to talk about two of what I think are widely recognized as the most successful boycotts, certainly in American history. And I should mention that boycotts are generally a tool, as they were for the tenant farmers, of people who have very little power on their own, right? I mean, these tenant farmers had no money, no organization, no leader, no nothing, but they did have this economic tool. And in the case of the Montgomery bus boycott, a very similar situation. And this is a story a lot of you are already familiar with, which is that buses were segregated throughout the South at the time that this bus boycott started, which was the 1950s. And Black organizers and civic leaders had been organizing for this bus boycott for many years, really starting in the 1940s. And several people had been arrested before Rosa Parks finally was arrested in 1955 for doing exactly what Rosa Parks did, sitting in the whites only section of the bus and refusing to give up their seats when the bus driver told them to do it. For a whole variety of reasons, Viola White and Claudette Colvin and Mary Smith, who all preceded Rosa Parks, were not selected as the face of the Montgomery boycott. They wanted someone who was sort of, morally impeccable, regarded as a leader in the community. And Rosa Parks fit that description to a T. She was the secretary of the local NAACP and a well-known leader in the community. It wasn't an accident. It was a very much planned thing when she sat down in that seat and refused to get up. And she had a whole bunch of organizations behind her when she did this. And some of them are listed here, not just the NAACP, but several others. And actually, it was, well, I'll mention that the leaders and the people who got arrested for taking these seats, as you can see from these pictures, were all women. And interestingly enough, when Martin Luther King finally was asked to come on and lead the boycott, and this was after Rosa Parks got arrested, he became the recognized national leader for the boycott and was definitely responsible for a lot of its successes. But you can see in this photo that was taken when the bus boycott finally ended, 381 days after it started, there's almost no women in the picture. And the only woman I can see is Coretta Scott King there. So the civil rights movement wasn't always perfect in its day as far as equality of women, because as usual, I think in a lot of these activist organizations, women did do the bulk of the work and even some of the sacrifice that was involved in winning the day. But how did they do it? And I'm not going to go over everything in this sort of complicated timeline, but there's a few points I want to make. And the first is that there were so many civic organizations involved in planning this whole thing way before Rosa Parks got arrested that they were ready the day she got arrested to meet all the black churches, the civil rights organizations, met the day after she got arrested and agreed they were going to do a 1 day boycott on December 5th. They were going to test it out and see if they could really pull it off. And what they did is they organized carpools, they organized people to walk to work, and they organized the black taxi companies who all agreed to charge only 10 cents for a ride. And what they knew was that because 75% of the bus ridership in Montgomery were black people, they had a pretty good chance of having a pretty large impact, but they just weren't sure. But it turned out on December 5th, the day of their 1 day strike, the buses were empty. They knew they had pulled it off. And at that point, they voted to continue the boycott until their demands were met. They voted to ask Martin Luther King, who was at that point a 26-year-old, fairly new pastor, to lead their movement. And their demands were pretty basic. It was just courteous treatment on the buses and first come, first serve seating. So it's kind of breaks your heart how simple and basic these demands were. And it gives you an insight into, of course, what the South was like at that time for Black people. They, of course, also had another demand that wasn't written there, and that was to create legislation that would overturn segregation on buses throughout the South. And by the fall of 1956, a year just about into the boycott, people continued to refuse to ride the buses. The bus companies were suffering. They were somewhere between 95 and 100% participation. And the city of Montgomery filed all kinds of lawsuits to get them to stop, threw people in jail. Nothing worked. And finally, after a bunch of court cases got escalated to the Supreme Court declared bus segregation laws unconstitutional. The boycott ended 381 days after it started. It was, of course, not the end of Jim Crow, not the end of segregation. Swimming pools, schools, hotels, theaters, lots of other things were still segregated. But it certainly was a huge spark and a huge proof of concept about the unity of the people involved and at the kind of power they could have when they unified together. So, excuse me, just about 10 years later, in a very different setting, but still a group of people, in some ways, even with less power, mostly Mexican or Mexican American farm workers, Filipino farm workers in California go on strike in the grape fields. And their conditions were terrible. They had absolutely no labor protections. They were written out of every piece of labor protection legislation at that time. They were constantly exposed to dangerous pesticides. Their wages were terrible. They go on strike for a contract, for the right to even negotiate a contract. But there are strike breakers galore. They don't seem to have a lot of power in their strike. The media is not paying very much attention to them, and there's no way they're getting the growers to the negotiating table. Then, s after some organizing, union dock workers, longshoremen, stop loading grapes onto ships and stop unloading them off of ships, mostly in California, but other places as well. So now grapes are rotting on the docks. And then a really strong movement of religious leaders comes to support the strike and the farm workers, but still not really getting the growers to budge. There's not been an economic impact yet. RFK Sr., of course, gets involved in 1966, and grape strikes start spreading across California. And in 1967, consumer boycott is initiated. And the idea there is we can't get the growers, we don't have enough power to get the growers to the table ourselves as strikers. But maybe if consumers in the big cities all across America stop buying grapes, then they will listen to us. And so what the union did is they financed hundreds of people, mostly college students, to spread out across the country in a few hundred cities. I myself ended up for a while in New York City and then for a while in Los Angeles. Everyone was paid $5 a week, but you had room and board in a very terrible location somewhere. And you had some kind of a car that had been donated, which frequently broke down. But it was an incredibly exciting time, and particularly because we were able to actually get the job done, that we could get consumers to stop buying grapes in stores. We could get supermarket chains to stop accepting non-union grapes. And by 1969, table grape sales are down 22%. And by 1970, the first union contracts are signed. So that consumer boycott was responsible for the start of what became many union contracts that the UFW negotiated and better working conditions for farm workers all around the country, but particularly in California. Still not great by any means, but a world of difference from before that 1965 strike. So, what are some of the features that both of these examples share? And I think other successful boycotts also. There were very clear targets. In Montgomery, it was don't ride the bus. We want to hurt the bus companies. We want them to suffer economically. And for the Great Boycott, very similar. We want the growers to feel the economic power and not have people buy table grapes. There were very clear demands. First come, first serve seating, be courteous to us. If we get those things, and also a Supreme Court decision, we'll get back on the buses. And they did. The same with the Great Boycott. Once the workers had a union contract, they went back to work. So it was a very clear demand. In both cases, there were incredibly strong organizations that had been organizing in these localities for many years before the boycotts were initiated. In Montgomery, it was NAACP, Black churches, civil rights organizations. In California, it was labor unions, religious leaders again, political leaders, and interesting, I think one of the common threads is that a united front of religious leaders were involved in very, very heavily in both of these efforts. Both of these efforts also had incredibly charismatic leaders. They were famous people. They had kind of moral credibility, moral standing, um, and they were effective organizers also. And whether that was Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks or Cesar Chavez, uh, they were critical to the success of these movements. Another sometimes overlooked thing is that organizers made sure that if you asked people to boycott and make a sacrifice, that there were alternatives available to them. And that's why so much effort in Montgomery went into organizing carpools and the black taxi cab companies, et cetera. For the Great Boycott, that wasn't so difficult, right? There's all kinds of fruits in the world, and most people can live without table grapes. Lettuce was a little harder, truthfully, um, but but not terrible. It was easy to convince people you can go without iceberg lettuce for a little while. The final thing I want to mention that really made these boycotts successful. And by the way, these things took a long time. The bus boycott was over a year. The Great Boycott was just about 3 years. But they had a way to measure whether they were being successful along the way. I mean, there were photographs of those empty buses in Montgomery. The bus companies started losing money. In California, I mean, there were actually pictures of grapes rotting in the field because no one would harvest them, grapes rotting in the docks. And then the sales reports from the supermarket chains, about sales of grapes. And at some point, sales were down 22%. So there was a way for organizers to measure how successful they were being, but also for the public and for politicians to see how effective these boycotts were. So if we fast forward like more than 55 years to just a little while ago, when Jimmy Kimmel was taken off the air by Hulu Disney conglomerate. And people all around the world rallied in the name of free speech, not just because they loved Jimmy Kimmel, but because it seemed like a huge attack on free speech to take him off the air for something he said that was his opinion. So there was a clear target in the boycott of Hulu Disney, which was cancel them. There were instructions online on how to do it. There were clear demands. You restore Jimmy Kimmel, we'll come back on again. Unlike those older boycotts, though, there weren't a lot of well-known organizations that came to the front anyway, when in order to promote this boycott. And really, what took the place of, let's say, the churches or the civil rights organizations was social media and the millions of outraged people who got on social media and said, we got to do something, right? And so that allowed, sort of this rapid response. I mean, from the time he was taken off the air, it was only 6 days until Disney announced they'd put him back on the air again. So that is the kind of speed and level of organization that wouldn't have been possible 60 years earlier. There were some charismatic leaders involved, but not of the caliber of a Cesar Chavez or Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. But there were famous people definitely promoting the boycott. There were available alternatives, right? There's other streaming services out there. And there were some metrics for success. I mean, Disney kept their finances pretty tight, and people haven't really been able to tell exactly how much money they lost, but it looks like cancellations doubled in the time period of this boycott over what their normal level of cancellations would be. It was certainly enough to make them capitulate and look very foolish and cowardly in the process. So today, where are we? That Hulu Disney boycott seems like it was about a year ago, But one effort that's really kind of risen to the top amidst all of the many things that you're being asked to boycott is this campaign called We Ain't Buying It. And the goal is that on 4 or 5 of the biggest shopping days annually in America, which starts with Black Friday, November 27th, and goes to Cyber Monday, which is December 1st, don't buy in these three major corporations anything: Amazon, Home Depot, and Target. So there's pretty clear targets, check. And there's pretty clear demands also. Target needs to reinstate their DEI policies, the ones they dropped under pressure from Trump. Home Depot needs to refuse cooperating with ICE, which apparently they've been doing when the raids happen at their parking lots. And Amazon needs to withhold funding the Trump regime because they've been throwing money at Trump every possible way, signing contracts, including with ICE. And so they want a disconnect between Amazon and the Trump regime. So the demands are pretty clear also. Check. It's great. There are some gaps, though. And one of the things I'm concerned about is I don't know how anyone's going to measure how successful this is. Um, it's going to be a great way for us to organize and kind of practice organizing a big boycott. The companies will feel it one way or the other. We just not be able to gauge how much they're feeling it. None of us thinks we're going to put them out of business. Um, if any of them changes a policy, we'll of course know that we've been successful, but it's going to be hard to figure out as we go how successful this really has been. In terms of alternatives, now the kinds of sacrifices that are being asked now, like don't shop at Amazon, for some of us, that's a huge sacrifice. Um, don't shop at Home Depot. For my husband, that would be a pretty big sacrifice. Don't shop at Target. These are stores people rely on, and it's not just one thing that you're not buying, it's avoiding the entire store. So there's an issue there. I'll talk about it in a second. The other gap I see, which again may not be as important as it might have once been, but who are the leaders? Who are the organizations that are pulling us all together, giving us the kind of moral compass, reminding us what the message is and what the demands are, that are keeping this thing alive and keeping us responsive? They're not really there. Indivisible National, I think, has stepped up in a way that I have appreciated very much. But we really don't know who's started even this way. We ain't buying it. Effort. It's sort of taken off, and people have grabbed onto it, and it's worth paying attention to. So I'll mention that we put together some lists of alternatives to shopping at Target, Home Depot, and Amazon. That's the graphic on the right, and a list of minority-owned businesses in San Diego County. These are just starting projects. They're both Google Documents or Google Sheets. Larry's going to put the links to both of those in the chat. And hopefully, if you have things you want to add to that list, you'll be able to comment on those lists and let me know. And we'll sort of keep these going as living documents because I think we're going to need them going into the future. We know this is not going to be the only boycott that's suggested as time goes on.
Wendy,
Yeah,
there's a comment from Cindy that she can't see the images.
really.
Is
Or
anybody else having a problem with that?
it doesn't look like it. No problems here. Yeah, so Cindy, you're being treated to Zoom world. There's there's
Okay,
some
I'll work with
something
Cindy on
that
that.
Larry might be able to help out with. Thank you, Larry. Okay. And sorry about that. Um, Charismatic leaders. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about how so many of the previous boycott movements were led by remarkable people. And I added Nelson Mandela in here because of one of the boycotts I didn't talk about, one of the successful ones, which was the Don't Buy South African Goods, which was a big part of the end of apartheid. Where is that person in our movement today? That's a question mark. But what I'm going to suggest is that it's you, it's all of us. That at this point we are that person, and we have tools that maybe the leaders in the past didn't have, which is primarily social media and our networks and the ease with which we can communicate with one another to really lead the way and to be the trusted, credible person who, when you say this boycott is worth following, the people who know you and trust you are going to listen to you. So, I mean, I certainly hope we see a leader of this stature emerging in the future. I think we will. But I also think we absolutely can't discount the power that we have shown so far in leading this movement, and that I think we can even expand on in the future. And I think boycotts are a tremendous way for us to take this kind of leadership and action. So, just quick wrap up on that. Um, Boycotts going forward. How do we decide which ones make sense? I would just reiterate clear targets, clear demands, and good metrics for measuring success. Look for strong coalitions behind these boycotts. Some of them out there, and even this We Ain't Buying That, we don't know exactly who's organizing them. They've taken off anyway. So, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but certainly the more backing we see from credible and strong coalitions, the more people are going to hop on and hop onto the bandwagon. Using your networks and your social media to take leadership, and then consult trusted organizations like Take Action San Diego, like Indivisible, like some of the organizations that you are involved with, about which ones are making sense in this particular moment. We don't know always right now. We can't predict what that will be. So I think that's it for boycotts. What I want to do before I just take another few minutes at the end to tell you about some upcoming events is I will stop sharing my screen and I will see if people have any questions.